watch it again. All right, so let's kick us off. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to this Secondhand Travels in the New Global Garage Sale book chat. This is the fourth book virtual chat that Remake has held. And I am Sam Hartsock, your host for today. I'm the Director of Education here at Remake. And if you aren't familiar with Remake, we're a nonprofit working to make fashion a force for good. We do this by holding brands accountable, and a lot of that we've been doing this summer as we've been demanding that brands pay up, which to date has unlocked an estimated over $1 billion in canceled orders in Bangladesh and an estimated $8 billion globally. But we're not done yet. We're on a mission to create a fashion industry that is worker-centric, that is ethical and sustainable. And in partnership with a coalition of garment workers, labor organizers, researchers, and citizen activists, we've outlined 7 actions it will take for us to get there, from continuing to demand that brands pay up for the orders that they canceled from March to May, when COVID really started hitting throughout the US and globally, to signing enforceable contracts with their manufacturers, to giving workers center stage at fashion summits, to fashion weeks, and a variety of other sustainability and future of fashion events. And if you want to learn more about where our focus will be moving forward, you can check out payupfashion.com. I'll drop it in our little chat here, or you can join our efforts and sign the petition on that site as well. So that's a little bit about us. Thank you all for coming here and joining us. Now we can dive into our chat with Adam about secondhand travels in the new global garage sale. And Adam, I thought a great way to start if you want to just kind of give a little intro and background to yourself.
Sure. Well, I'm a genetic recycler. I tell people I grew up in a junkyard, and it's the truth. I come from a century-old recycling family. My great-grandfather came from Russia without any education, English skills whatsoever, landed in Galveston, Texas, and he needed to make a living. So he made a living by literally picking rags off the street. So when we talk about rag pickers in the rag industry, in North America, he was from it. And he went from that, picking up rags off the street and selling them, to textile recyclers, mostly for paper making, to being a metal recycler and moving up to the Twin Cities. And so I grew up with that in my blood, both literally and figuratively. You spend time around a junkyard, and eventually realized I'm not made for business. I'm made for writing about business. So I became a journalist who writes about the global recycling industry. And a few years ago, I started writing more intensively about reuse, and that brought me into writing about textiles again, and sort of closing the loop, if you will, on my family, coming back to where it all started for us a century ago. So that's kind of how I've ended up here talking about secondhand travels in the new global garage sale.
Cool. And this is the second book you've written on this
Correct.
topic, right?
Right. Yeah. The first book was Junkyard Planet, Travels in the Billion-Dollar Trash Trade, which was very much focused on the blue bin or green bin, I guess, depending on the color it is where you live, which was literally the recycling bin. And so I wanted to, towards the end of that book, I started thinking more about, okay, recycling is great, but ultimately the goal should be reducing waste. And so I thought it was time to start taking a deep dive into reuse and refurbishment and making things last longer, and ultimately thinking about how consumers, through their own actions of consumption, can make a difference.
Yeah, that's a lot about what we talk about at Remake.
Sure.
Well, thank you for that intro. And before we dive into a couple questions I have for Adam, if everyone who's here wanted to drop your name into the chat, kind of where you're joining from and what you're excited to learn, we can make sure we cover that on the call today. And then there's a Q&A box. If you want to use that, you can put any questions there, and I'll monitor that box and make sure we get them covered with Adam today. So let's dive in. Okay, so the first question I had for you, Adam, is kind of like, can you tell us a little bit more about your impetus for writing Secondhand Travels in the new global garage sale? I know you kind of covered that a little bit in your intro, but to dive into that a little more, and then kind of what was your biggest surprise or learning moment you had while writing this book?
Yeah. So, I mean, people always ask me how long this book took me to write. I could say in some sense it took a century, because it really goes back to my great-grandfather. But I started thinking seriously about this subject about a decade ago. I'd always been a thrifter. I'd always been somebody who loved garage sales. But I was an international journalist. And it was when I first went to Africa and Ghana and started seeing secondhand computers and secondhand clothing flowing into the Ghanaian markets that it started to occur to me that maybe there's something I can say about this topic and really go deep into what happens to our secondhand stuff. And it really, for me, didn't coalesce into a book, though, until it became very personal. And that was after my mother passed away a few years ago. And my sister and I were left having to figure out what to do with her stuff. And, it's a very human problem. And to some extent, we all go through it, if not a parent, a spouse, a sibling, a friend, a partner, whatever it may be. And, my sister and I, we had all this stuff. We had her clothing, her dishes, and everything else. And slowly, over the course of a couple of years, we unloaded it, I guess, gave it away, whoever wanted it. And at the end of the process, we were left with her beloved china. And I was living in China at the time, so I wasn't going to ship that over. My sister was living in New York in a small co-op with her husband, and she didn't need it because she already had hers. So we had a conversation that a lot of people have. You take the china. No, you take the china. No, she'd want you to have it. No, she'd want you to have it. Let's take it to Goodwill. And as we're in line at the Goodwill, at the drive-through drop-off, it suddenly connected to me. I don't know what happens when the china goes into the Goodwill. And so I thought, it's time for somebody to write a book that shows what happens when the stuff goes through the Goodwill doorway. And so I wanted to do a book about that. In terms of the biggest revelation for me in this book, the general one is there's far more stuff out there. And I'm not just talking clothing, though you guys know the clothing world very well. There's far much more clothing out there than can ever be reused. Good clothing, poor clothing, stuff in general. And for me, that really came home when I was reporting in Japan with a company called Book Off, which is, Japan has this wonderful reuse culture and industry. And it was a great joy of mine in reporting this book. I spent around 6 weeks in Japan learning about the reuse industry. And so I spent time at Book Off. They have about 900 locations throughout Japan. And one of the things they do is sell books. That's how they started, but they now do clothing. And they took me to their warehouse where they receive books. People can mail books from around Japan, and then they sort through them and sell them. And this warehouse is enormous. They get tens of thousands of books a day, and 2/3 of them, there's just no market. So they have to go to the paper mill. Now, as an author, that just killed me to see those books being tossed into a bin and off to the paper mill. But what do you do with something that nobody else wants? And as we all know, this is not just about books. I mean, it is about clothing. And I saw that with clothing, up in Mississauga, Ontario, with jeans, poor quality jeans that nobody wants. They're too hard to recycle, and the same sort of process happens. So that was really the revelation for me. It came together when I saw all those books headed to a paper mill in Yokohama, Japan, but it repeated throughout the process of reporting the book.
Yep, that's great. Yeah, I loved when you were kind of unpacking and telling the story more deeply about what happens, when a loved one dies and that process that people have to go through of carrying out the house. It really hit home for me because I spent all of July at my mom's place, and we were like going through her garage, and she has so many issues with like financial struggles with my dad, which is why they are fought with financial fights with my dad, which is like why they held on to everything. Her parents moved all the time and constantly threw out her stuff, so she held on to anything and everything of her grandparents. It's just amazing what you collect over time, and that
it is, and
take care of that when you're done.
And it's not just Americans. And one of the things I really wanted to do with the book was to show, I mean, I think we're very focused on how Americans consume, but I wanted to show it's not just Americans who leave behind these states and piles of stuff. And so that's one of the reasons why I went to Japan, because the Japanese accumulate as much, if not more so, than we do. And they have the same issue. And I think we have it in our mind, the land of Marie Kondo, they don't, they're very good about, downsizing, minimizing, and not buying more stuff. No, the reason why Marie Kondo came out of Japan is because they need a Marie Kondo, and they need her constantly. And I really wanted to bring that to readers and non-readers, attention, that this is a very human problem we have in consumer societies. We're all sort of drowning in this stuff, and it has an emotional cost on top of the environmental costs.
Yeah, drowning in this stuff, that nailed it. That's kind of like why I got into this work in the first place, is I found that my parents were like drowning in this stuff. And my first internship was at J.C. Penney's, and I had that realization of like, oh my gosh, I'm working for a mass merchandiser. There's like 10 other of them, and like this is the problem of drowning in stuff. I'm sure it resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, just to that point, I mean, for me, there's so many moments in writing this book that meant a lot to me. But one of the things I did was in writing was I basically sat on a stool at the donation door of a Goodwill in Tucson, Arizona, for days and days and hours at a time. And I just watched the stuff being donated coming through the door. And it really had a profound impact on me because I would go home. We rented a place for a little while in Tucson while I was working on the book. And I'd go home and I'd talk to my wife about it and just, I was just so down about it, because it's just an enormous amount of stuff. You cannot possibly hope to sell all that stuff. And they don't. And it changed our consumption habits.
Yeah. I mean, this is a great segue question to Maya, who asked kind of like wanting to learn what Goodwill does with the items they can't sell. Also interested in international secondhand resale in general. But if you want to speak a little bit to that.
Sure. Yeah, this is one of my favorite subjects. And it was something I really wanted to know. I should preface it by saying, every Goodwill federation operates differently. So there's, I forget the number. I think it's 140 different Goodwill federations around the United States, meaning they all have their territory and they operate within that territory. And so each federation operates differently. So I'm in Minnesota right now. There's a Goodwill federation that basically operates the southern half of Minnesota. I reported intensively in the Goodwill of Southern Arizona, which is just as it sounds like. So I'm going to speak very generally, but as I do it, keep in mind that every Goodwill will do things differently. So you probably know the figure, only about one third of everything that a Goodwill or a thrift store puts on the shelf sells off the shelves. The rest then goes back into the back room. Some of it will go to an outlet center and be sold by the pound. But the rest of it then is going to be mostly marketed, especially the textiles, internationally. And that is a very big business. And Goodwill loves it because it's critical to them floating their financials. The purpose of Goodwill is not to sell stuff, but it's to pay for job training programs. And they do wonderful work. And I'm a big supporter of what they do with job training for underprivileged Americans. So they have an incentive to find the most money out there for the stuff. And they are very sophisticated. Each federation will usually have somebody who's devoted to taking calls from people all over the world. When I was in Southern Arizona, the person who I spent time with, he showed me his Rolodex, and it's, names of people in Pakistan and in India, and throughout East Africa. And they're constantly calling him saying, can I get a load? Can I get a load? And so Goodwill very much wants to send that onward to them. In most cases, they won't sell directly to somebody, say, in India or Pakistan, but they'll actually sell to a grader. And there are two big grading centers in North America, one in Houston and one in Mississauga, Ontario, outside of Toronto. And the graders in Toronto, which is where I spent my time, there's about 15, 16 of them. It moves around a little bit and it depends how you define them. But they will buy tens of thousands of pounds of clothes a day, bring them to Mississauga, sort them for various markets. They will know how to sort for Ghana. They'll know how to sort for India. They'll know how to sort for Pakistan. And they'll pay on that basis. And some of them will even install containers at Goodwill so that the stuff can just be deposited in the container and sent up there. And then they will sort it. So it's a very complicated supply chain. But the goal of it is to maximize the revenues that they can get from the clothes that are donated. So I know there's a lot of myths out there about Goodwill dumping clothes. And the thing to keep in mind with that is that dumping, whether it be dumping into a dump or dumping into a foreign country, costs Goodwill money. You have to pay to dump. And so they want to make money from it. And so they'll generally find people who see value in that stuff and purchase it from them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of understanding that's another incentive of, us as people who are taking our items to Goodwill to ensure that they're kind of in that good quality as well. And not, because I know when COVID was starting, you were seeing a lot of pictures of people just like throwing their clothes on the curbs of Goodwills and leaving them overnight and maybe getting ruined because of storms or who knows what else. It's just that idea of us who are donating our clothes. It's like, let's take care of those clothing from our use to when they go start this whole other journey that they're about to go on to.
Yeah, that's so true. And one of the things I really learned from Goodwill is people will dump their garbage onto Goodwill. That could be textiles that just don't have a market, And so when I say don't have a market, I mean, if there's some really cheap textiles, and we all know, you all know it better than I do, but what the cheap stuff is, there will be a market for that. It may be cut into rags. It may end up as stuffing somewhere. But they make less money from that. And if you're giving them soiled stuff, they will have to throw it away. And that takes away money from the job training programs that they want to fund.
Mm-hmm. And then outside of clothing, and I know you mentioned books, what's the other kind of like big category item that you see coming through kind of like
Uh,
secondhand channels?
Sure. Well, clothing is the big one,
Yeah.
and and any thrift store will tell you that that's their bread and butter, including Goodwill. It's their most important source of revenue, including shoes. Shoes are very big as well, and people sometimes forget that there is a massive market out there, especially globally, in shoes. But number three recently has been electronics. And so everything from your old phones to your old stereo equipment, and it can also include, we don't tend to think of, an old mini fridge from your dorm room as electronics, but as a waste or as a used good, it's treated as such. And so though that category is growing very rapidly, and it's becoming an important source of revenue for the thrift industry, it's also becoming an important source of cost because some of that stuff it cannot be resold, it cannot be exported. And so it's an entire book in its own right, actually, to write about that. I have a few chapters in this book about it.
Yep. Okay, great. Then my next question for you is, especially understanding this year, what have you seen as the impact of COVID-19 on the resale industry? Or are you doing any kind of research currently
I have.
to secondhand?
Yeah, I mean, initially COVID was a disaster for let's just talk about thrift, not even resale yet, but let's talk thrift because it is the biggest part of it, and it sort of keeps everything else rolling. It was a twin disaster for the thrift industry. On one end, you had global trade stop, and so because global trade stopped, all of these markets that buy and bought secondhand clothes, Kenya, India, Pakistan, they weren't bringing it in. And there were fears about surface transmission, so they weren't bringing it in for that reason, and just the container vessels weren't there. So you had nobody purchasing it. Meanwhile, you had lots of folks in wealthy developed countries doing what, Sam, you were just saying you were doing, cleaning things out, wanting to donate. And so the thrift industry suddenly had the biggest flood they've ever had. A couple of years ago, we had the Marie Kondo flood. That was nothing compared to what happened this spring. And there was just nowhere for it to go. I talked to my contacts in Tucson, and they were really panicked because on one hand, the thrift industry wants your donations. And so they went and rented a warehouse to hold all the stuff that was coming in. But at the same time, that's a carrying cost, So it caused them all kinds of financial trouble, and they could not move the stuff. The good news is that things are starting to move again. The thrift stores have reopened. So not only is the global trade starting to happen, and that's starting to move a little bit, but people can go into the thrift stores. I was just in a Goodwill a few days ago with my son, and people are there and they're buying. And so that disruption is starting to loosen up. And the neat thing about it was that you had an enormous amount of what I call the good stuff come through the thrift stores. So stuff that maybe would have gone onto a Poshmark or a ThredUp, the higher quality stuff that hasn't been going to Goodwill as much recently. People were just saying, I got to get rid of this now. And it went in, and that allowed the thrift stores. And I talk about Goodwill a lot, but it was Salvation Army, all these other ones. They were actually able to make up some of their revenue because they were getting some of these donations that have been diverted elsewhere in recent years, as resale has gone online and the Poshmarks and the ThredUps have come online. So it's been a very interesting time from a business perspective, what COVID-19 has done to this industry.
Yeah, I know we had a couple conversations initially around just one when we had no information really about COVID-19 and, does it transfer via clothing or how does everyone gets sick? So I know we talked with a couple people who were running swaps or running thrift stores, and that was an initial scare, but it's nice to know that, that likelihood is so low. So I feel like that's also helped the thrift industry.
It really has. And I mean, you can understand, India and Pakistan and Kenya, are three of the world's biggest importers of secondhand. And you can understand they did not want to be importing containers of COVID. Now we know it probably isn't transmitted via clothes anyway, but 60 days in a seaborne container, it's gone.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Okay. So then kind of the next question is a little more hopefully hopeful and looking forward, kind of from writing this book and as you were learning and kind of your experience in this industry. So how do you think we as consumers or citizens encourage more durable and repairable goods out there, right? It's like goods that will last long, goods that will make it through one person's kind of love cycle into another's.
Yeah, I love this question, and because I think it's really exciting, and I think it's starting to happen, albeit on very small scales. I mean, organizations like Remake are awesome because you are raising consciousness around this issue amongst people who can influence this issue, and that I hate to use the term trickle down, but it spills out into a wider population. And I think we're starting to see it occur in a couple of really exciting ways that isn't just about clothing, but we're starting to see it in clothing. And I call it the used car model. I know you're thinking, well, we're about clothes, not used cars. But the thing that I've always found interesting about used cars and car lots is it makes consumers think differently about how they buy and sell. So, if you buy a new car or even a used car, at least speaking for myself, I'm always thinking, what's the resale value of that? I'm going to drive it for this many years. And then when I'm done with it and ready to get a new car or move back to Malaysia or whatever it's going to be, I want to sell it and get as much out of it as possible. And the new car dealerships know that their customers want to do that. They set up used car lots. Sure, bring it in. We'll give you credit to a new car. And so as a car owner, that makes you do a couple things. One, you want to buy as good a car as you can. And two, you want to take care of it. And we're starting to see that move into other areas of the consumer sphere. Area number one, electronics. You can basically treat an Apple store as a used car lot now. I've done it. You have an old phone and you don't want it anymore. You can take it to Apple and they'll evaluate it and say, okay, we're going to give you X amount of credit for it so you can buy a new one. It's a used car model. And we're starting to see apparel companies do it. And Patagonia is the one who's done it most prominently, where they will actually accept trade-ins for credit. And I think that does something really interesting to consumer psychology. And that is, it makes people think, okay, if I buy this now, I'm buying it for a second user. And that's the incentive to keep things going longer. And, I just think that is one of the most promising things in consumer behavior of the last 30 years, that we're starting to see the car lot spread out into these spaces. And what I'd love to see, and we're starting to see it, is that consumers of various types of products, electronics and apparel, are asking their favorite brands to do this. Start treating it not so much as a rental, but as as a product that's going to have multiple users. And I think that's really, really exciting. And being able to encourage brands to do that, I think is really important in it. And I think we're going to see more of it. In fact, I know we are, because I've talked to a couple brands that are planning on doing it. There are other ways that you can sort of take it beyond that. I think one of the things that has been tested out in Europe, and there's some pretty good consumer behavior surveys on it, is durability labeling. And this is just what it sounds like. You buy something and it tells you how long it's going to last. Now, this isn't going to work for every kind of product in the same way. I mean, a washing machine, you can buy it and it can tell you it will last. The motor's designed to last for 5,000 cycles or 10,000 cycles, and then as a consumer, you compare that to the one that maybe lasts 3,000 cycles. But it is possible for apparel manufacturers and textile manufacturers to give people a sense of how many washes something can last. What kind of strength that particular fabric is designed to handle. More prominent labeling of thread counts and what that means. And it has been done because there are durability standards for textiles that go into furniture. And they've actually been established by the US government. So why couldn't we start doing this with apparel? And in fact, there's some very good testing, as I said, and I footnoted in Secondhand that's going on in the EU that's promoting that. And I think that kind of thing will help promote this sort of used car model, which I'm so excited about.
So here you say a couple things. One, we got to keep letting brands know what we want.
Mm-hmm.
Like, go to your favorite brand, go to their Instagram page, go to their Twitter, go to the places they show up, and let them know that you want a take back program. Like, yes, you want them to make clothes that you can give back to them and go more. I know, I feel like I'm starting to see ThredUp partner with organizations or brands to do that too.
Yeah.
And then can you give us a little preview of those brands that you're talking to that might be?
I can't yet. I can't talk about it yet. I'm sorry. Right. I'm doing it for Bloomberg, and I'm not supposed to say anything. But probably in late October, early November, we'll be able to talk about it a little more. But there's really exciting stuff coming on, and I'll tell you, if you have favorite brands, if you have any kind of pipeline to brands, tell them you want them to buy back your stuff, or at least give you credit for it, you know?
Yep. I mean, I think that's one thing we've learned at Remake is, especially in the fashion industry, brands are so reputationally aware from a risk
Hmm.
perspective, from an opportunity perspective. So they truly value what their customers, what their fans are saying and
Yeah.
want.
And there's a business case for it too. I mean, you know, for so long, you know, it's been, well, this is charity, or this is do-gooderism, and that,
Yeah.
and there, I mean, I'm a very committed environmentalist and conservationist, don't get me wrong, but there is a business case. I mean, when I spoke to Patagonia at length for Secondhand, you know, they said, we love being able to resell our clothes because it allows consumers to get into our brand at a lower price point, you know, which is precisely what used car lots do. Okay. You know, you can't buy that Ford whatever, you know, new, but you might be able to afford it as a 4-year-old car with 60,000 miles on it, you know, and it allows you to get into our brand. Well, that's the business case for it. And, you know, Patagonia has been very successful over the last few years. And I don't mean to keep promoting them. I can't talk about these other brands yet. But you see my point. There is money to be made doing this.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And it kind of helps address this conversation of accessibility that's existed in the sustainable fashion space too. So that's one.
Absolutely. You know, and it's very important to me. You know, when I talk about a brand like Patagonia, I'm keenly aware that it's not accessible to everybody, at least as a new product. You know, and it's a privilege. And
Yep.
so I like the fact that we're able to broaden access to those kinds of qualities, and because it is a quality product to more people.
Yeah. And the other thing I heard you say kind of had a lot to do around consumer education and awareness. So one, it's like having these durability labels, but also making sure people understand what those labels mean, and kind of this like
Absolutely.
elevating of, let's understand what textiles are. Like, let's have a basic understanding of what textiles mean, how to best take care of them, how to care for our clothes over time too. I think that's kind of a lost art that we're trying to bring back.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the disposability of clothing allows us to forget that these are things that are made by hand, and you've been addressing that, you know, beautifully over the years, and especially with the Pay Up campaign.
Cool. Well, just to the audience, I have two more questions for Adam. Wanted to give y'all a heads up in case y'all have specific ones that you want to address. I'm not able to access my Q&A thing for some reason. Zoom's being wonky. So if you just wanted to drop them in the chat, that would be great, and I'll pass them along. All right. So we talked about, you know, how consumers can hold brands accountable, this idea around durability labeling, which is great. What kind of other innovations do you think that we need to really start seeing a true circularity model? Because a lot of this has to do with consumers holding brands accountable, taking better care of our clothes, but still a lot in the textile industry, it's hard to break down clothing and turn it into new. Like, what do you think is missing, or what do you see on the edge that maybe we don't have an insight into?
Well, I have the first thing that comes to mind, and I have very mixed feelings about this, but though I know it's a necessity, is that we are going to see textile recycling, true textile recycling in the next few years, especially of polycotton blends, which we all know have been a real problem. I mean, you know, a piece of cotton, you know, a cotton t-shirt, pure cotton t-shirt can be turned into a wiping rag and used, but a polycotton, you know, if you have that polyester in there, it may spark, so it can't be used in certain functions. So we're moving towards, and I think we're going to see in the next 5 years, chemical recycling of these polycotton blends, where you can actually separate out the cotton and the polyester. And I think you will see a lot of brands really jump onto that. I think it's great because it's a recycling solution. It's a reuse solution down the line. What I hope doesn't happen, but I fear may, is that some of the brands that have really embraced polycotton blends because they're cheap will say, good, we can continue doing this. And so in a sense, the recycling will continue to promote, you know, a disposability mindset with clothing. You know, well, you know, you've worn it 4 times and then you can just throw it into the chemical vat and we'll you know, squeeze out another whatever t-shirt. And so I have very mixed feelings about that. And yet The pragmatist in me, the one who has, traveled to emerging markets and seen how badly they want and need their own textiles, their own clothes, know that this is going to have to be there, and it's going to have to be one component of sort of the recycling waste chain, the reuse chain. And what I would hope is that the brands, that organizations like Remake, that there is an engagement, a kind of education that says, look, this is available to you, but this isn't necessarily the best end use for your garment. There are better, less energy intensive, environmentally intensive ways to be reusing things. And that starts with buying something that maybe isn't the polycotton blend in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that nails it on the head why we start a lot of our conversations with buy less, right?
Yeah.
Really just like reducing that consumption, increasing
Absolutely.
that quality, understanding what quality means from this like long-term circularity perspective. Like you said, buying something that's 100% cotton versus a poly cotton blend,
Yeah.
I think is so important. And I think also what you're talking about is the general difficult piece in the reuse conversation, no matter what this industry is. We've been, sold that recycling is the end all
Right.
be all and the easy to do for consumers at our households across states. And, I think what people are finding out is, that's been a big game, big ploy or whatever that hasn't really worked. So I think
Yeah.
recycling almost needs another rebrand or
Yeah.
re-education in general too.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. I'm a child of the recycling
Yeah.
industry. I love recycling, but I'm keenly aware. I've seen it for years that there's a misuse of recycling, and it can be misused as a way to promote unnecessary consumption.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is also, it's important as a lot of brands are pushing circularity because, like you said, it's this impetus of like, oh, great, we can create more product. We can keep
Hmm.
our business model rolling. And I think, again, it just drives home the point of how us as citizens and consumers need to make sure we have a voice in this conversation because it's like,
Right.
hey, that's cool that you can do that. It's great innovation that we can do that now, but we need to look at this system as a whole and really reduce that consumption.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Kathleen has a question here that's related. She asked, should brands adopt on-demand manufacturing? So like, what is the incentive for brands or vertical retailers to adopt circularity? If you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that, and I mean, I think there's something really attractive there because anything that brings consumers closer to production, to the production process, I think is a net positive. It's an incentive in many cases to reduce that consumption, especially if, as I think it will be, on demand is probably going to be more expensive. So I think, if you can actually get, and I'm not for raising the cost of clothing, don't get me wrong. I want clothing accessible, but I also want people to have a greater appreciation for how it's made and how close they are to it. I always talk, when I talk to recycling audiences, and I'll talk to people about paper and plastics, I always compare it to the meat industry. We don't really know how our meat is made. We don't want to know how the sausages are made. We don't want to know how our stuff is made. We don't want to see the factories. Whether it be a factory in Bangladesh or a recycling factory, because people really don't like to see the reality of recycling either. It's an industrial process, even the nicest one. And so anything that brings people closer to that process and gives them a level of appreciation for what goes into the production of their clothing and their stuff, I think is a net positive. And so, yeah, I think it's a very good way to promote reductions in consumption.
Yeah. I think the one thing we found too in this conversation we've been having around COVID-19 is that consumers, at least a growing subset of consumers, are ready to have a more thoughtful, more specific, more business oriented conversation about their products too. I think just that base level of awareness has grown over time. So I feel like more than even 2 years ago, 5 years ago, people are ready to have that conversation, just like
Yeah.
how clothes are made and peel back more of the details of that.
Yeah. Can I jump in with something? Because I'm so excited to talk to your audience about one thing.
Yeah.
And that's so, as I told you before we started, and this is just, I'm throwing this out there, and I hope somebody figures out a way to do this. I've lived in Asia, China and Malaysia since 2002. And when I moved over to China, Malaysia, for the first time in my life, I was air drying my clothes. And it's, it was a great inconvenience. You do it inside your home, there goes your living room or whatever it is. Nobody really has clothes dryers. They're very rare. And we have a 5-year-old. We air dry his clothes in our living room, but we did it. And then we came over to the United States this spring. I think we'd only be here for a few weeks for some business stuff that I had to do, some talks. And we got caught during COVID, and suddenly we found ourselves living in places without clothes air drying infrastructure. We found ourselves using dryers, and our clothing has gone to pieces. Literally, it's terrible what the dryers have done. So after 18 years of air drying, which initially I found a great inconvenience, and you don't like to, I mean, if you live in a 3-bedroom apartment, you don't like to devote one of the rooms to drying the clothes, to finding our clothes that had lasted for years suddenly falling apart because of dryers. I started wondering, how do we start a campaign to get people to air dry their clothes? How can, there has to be some way to do this. Like, we talk about durability, but for me, durability is great. But if you're using air dryers and heat, durability almost gets thrown out the window. And so, for me, I mean, if somebody on this call or anyone can figure out a way to make air drying in your home cool again, it would do so much for the durability and quality of clothing. And so I wanted, it's on my list of notes. I want to throw that out there. And I keep waiting for somebody to innovate this because it would do a world of good.
Feels like that's your call to action.
It may be,
Challenge to this group. I mean, that sounds something that's right up our channel at Remake. Yeah, it's interesting. I go in this back and forth struggle. My mom always air dried our clothes, and then my husband is very OCD, so he insists on doing our laundry, but he does it terribly, and he's just very like, I do the laundry and I will dry it, and this is what happens. And I'm usually like, fine, I'm not going to fight over doing the laundry.
Right.
But yeah, I was just telling him this morning, I'm like, what is wrong with our towels? They're so hard feeling. And there's our clothing. But yeah, I've noticed that same thing, as well as like my mom and the clothes she took care of lasted for so long. And then just my husband doing our clothes for the past 5 years has been a massive difference.
Yeah. So when we think about tangible calls to action and, things that could help the thrift industry, I mean, air dry those clothes. And I'm in Minnesota. We're going to be here till the end of the year. It looks like, come November, probably not going to be drying clothes outside anyway. But it's just, I mean, and sometimes I feel like we make these conversations harder than they need to be. We need to do this with the brands and work with the brand, do this and this and this. And yet this is a very tangible thing that individually people can do. And I just think it would make such a huge difference.
Right. And it's two-pronged. You're also saving on emissions and use and heating. Yeah. So there's a good, probably like dual campaign you could do there. Yeah. I love that. Well,
feel free to steal the idea, anybody.
All right, we will. Sophia had a question. Let's see. She says, shopping secondhand is the #1 way to start shopping more sustainably. That's something we found across our community as well. It's kind of a great entry point. However, a lot of people don't like the idea of buying used or kind of like previously worn, previously loved. In your opinion, what can the secondhand market do to help target those customers? Like, so really, like, how do you reach new people and bring them into secondhand? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the interesting things is we're starting, as we all know, it is expanding. People are coming into it, and they're coming into it young. I don't even know what the generations are called now. They give so many different letters. But anyway, teenagers are going into the thrift stores more than previous generations teenagers do. And I think Gen Z, I'm seeing somebody, but I heard Gen Y the other day too. I'm getting really confused by this stuff. I've been out of the States too long. And I think that the marketing by the thrift industry, by organizations that want to promote these movements, really need to be targeting younger people. And I think, I think there's been an effort. I'm not going to name organizations, but they've been trying to target more affluent consumers, middle age. And certainly you can tell them about the quality of the stuff that you have. But I think the excitement and the movement, getting people to change it, you have to be targeting the marketing young. And that's where I would be doing. Now, I'm no expert on targeting Generation Z, Y, whatever it is that we're calling it these days. But I just think that's where it really starts, and that's the consumer service. That's where I would go.
Yeah, and we find that a lot of our community and ambassadors who are often college students themselves or right out of college, like, buying secondhand often is already embedded in many of the things
Yeah.
we're doing, like growing up using Depop, reselling on Poshmark, all those
Yeah.
pieces way more too, which is really encouraging.
And I think it does, again, brands that are buying back their stuff and reselling it, whether it be in pop-up boutiques or whatever, can play such a critical role in this because, if it's a well-known brand that's doing it, there's a trust level there. I don't want to keep bringing up Patagonia, but I have to because I can't talk about these other ones yet. But Patagonia can say, we wash, we mend it, we make sure it's clean, that it's as good as new. That kind of stamp of approval really means a lot to a lot of people who are otherwise averse to the idea of secondhand shopping. And it's interesting. I was talking to somebody very recently in India who is actually trying to start a kind of like a Poshmark, somewhat similar, a Poshmark in India. It's targeting upper middle class consumers in India, which is a small percentage of the overall population, but it's India, so it's millions of people. And he said one of the things they've been talking about and trying to get this very hard to convince segment to adopt secondhand is they're trying to remind them of all the ways they already use secondhand. So they market to them their travel experiences. You stay in hotels, don't you? Do you think those are new sheets? And they market in that way to more affluent consumers. Well, if you're okay staying at the Taj and using their used bed sheets, why not come to our shop and buy some of our used stuff?
Yeah, I love that. It's like this is how it's already normalized in your life
Exactly.
as well.
Exactly.
And then to your question, Sophia, what we find is that also a lot of our Remake ambassadors, when they're talking about their use of secondhand already and the clothes that they're wearing and how they style, they find that they bring in new friends or friends of friends to start trying secondhand. And I know we ran a No New Clothes Pledge campaign over the summer and had 1,100 people take it. And just last year when we ran it for the first time, we had like 25 max. So it's just amazing to see how this conversation or like acceptance of buying, not new has really
Hmm.
escalated in the past year. And I can sure will only keep growing.
Yeah, it's super exciting, and I think it's important to keep in mind too that it's not just about clothing. I mean, it is an overall lifestyle movement. I mean, phones. The fastest growing segment of the phone industry in North America is secondhand phones. I'm holding one right here.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if I don't know, I'm not a marketing expert, but again, if you're marketing this stuff, you can roll that all into one ball, that it is a lifestyle that goes beyond apparel. It's affordable, it's fun, it's interchangeable. I think there's real possibilities there.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then Kathleen has a question, thinking with like a journalist hat on. So do you think journalists are doing enough investigative work to illuminate consumers on the ills of the industry? If not, how do we change that, or how are you changing that?
Yeah, well, I'm always reluctant to criticize fellow journalists, and I do it all the time. So I'm always of two minds about this. But I think there has been a lot of journalism out there over the last few years about what is going on in these factories in Cambodia and Bangladesh. It's accessible to people, and I think there are journalists doing good jobs. I think where we get into problems is I don't think editors are moving those stories up enough into the top pages of their news sites, whether it be the New York Times or the Washington Post or Bloomberg, with whom I work. I think that those stories need to be surfaced more. We can certainly all play a role in that, in promoting them, via social media. On the problematic side, I think there's been too much tendency to do these stories without sufficient fact checking. There's a lot of myths out there about that just have no factual basis. For example, there's a number that's floating around out there about the carbon emissions associated with apparel production, but it's based in no fact. There's no factual basis for it all. And I think as people who care about the subject, we need to be calling the reporters and the publications that put that stuff out without sufficiently fact checking it. We need to call them to task, because if they aren't called to task, it undermines the case that I think we're all trying to make and hope that this kind of journalism makes. What I personally would like to see more of, and one of the reasons amongst many that I wrote Secondhand is I want to see more writing about secondhand industry and how robust it is. and not just write. I love Poshmark. I think Poshmark is cool, and I think ThreadUp is awesome. And these are really important publications. I also want to see more writing about the thrift industry, which is not getting the really great stuff. That's because we all know the best stuff's on Poshmark and ThreadUp, right? But and you really got to go hunting at Goodwill. You got to go hunting at Salvation Army, local thrift shop. And we haven't done enough journalism on how important the clothing exports are to emerging markets, to clothing people, and how people in Rwanda are now smuggling secondhand into the country because it's affordable and necessary to them, even though Rwanda has officially raised the taxes, I think 200%, so as to promote its domestic new clothing industry. I think we need to be talking about that more, that, it's not just about thrifting, but secondhand plays an important role in the global economy. And that's the stuff I'd like to see more coverage of. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book.
That's great. Yeah, I feel like I really enjoyed your book, and I feel like it was a great evolution. Not that they're necessarily connected at all, but Travels of a T-shirt was
Oh,
one
I
of.
love that book. Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, that was the book I read back in undergrad, like a decade ago, but was kind of like the book that opened my eyes to the secondhand market. And I feel like secondhand provides, not just this narrowed perspective of a t-shirt, but kind of look at the global industry overall, and kind of takes you on these, you get like a taste of all these different stories that's happening across the world. And I appreciated that it wasn't very as like US centric too, as I initially thought when I picked it up.
Right.
I appreciated.
Well, thank you.
All right, so unless anyone has any questions, I will ask Adam his last question, which you kind of touched on, which I was going to say, like, what's your call to action for consumers? We at Remake really love ending our conversation with actionable takeaways. So we got one, someone's going to start this, like, let's start air drying our clothing more actions. And then kind of like, what would be your other call to action for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody listening kind of knows this, but about their stuff. But let me explain how I got here. Secondhand, it's a book about this global thing, but it's also a very personal book, as you know from reading it. And it started in many ways from a very personal place, dealing with a parent's things and stuff, and finding out what had value and what didn't, and spending time in Japan with people who were going through the same process. And for me, I buy secondhand. I'm not much of a shopper in the first place. I try not to shop secondhand or new, period. But we all have to buy stuff, and we all have to buy new stuff because stuff eventually wears out, whether you're air drying it or not. And so my approach to buying stuff these days has been to really buy with it in mind that somebody else is going to use down the line. If I'm buying something, I want it to be something that's going to have an owner beyond my son. I have a 5-year-old, and if you have a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old, they grow fast, and I don't want to be buying disposable stuff that he's able to fit in for 3.5 months, and then it ends up being turned into rags. I want stuff that can be reused. And so that's kind of my call to action beyond the air drying, beyond let's push brands to buy the stuff back. And let's push for durability labeling. Is just always have that in mind, that you're buying something that should have a legacy.
I love it. Love it so much. Well, thank you so much for your time, Adam. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being flexible and rescheduling so we can make this chat happen. Please know that you're forever a part of the Remake family, so we look forward to staying in touch. And for everyone on here, I will download this recording and share it with everyone who attended, and then it will be live on Remake's website. So
great. Thanks so much, Sam. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank y'all. Everyone have a great day.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.